And that's where the whole story of Mark's gospel ended. Later on, they came along, and you can see they added two more endings, a shorter ending and a longer ending. The shorter ending, particularly, is kind of like when a kid comes home from school and they've gotten in trouble, and the note says, Johnny was really bad, and then the child's handwriting, but the day got a lot better. It's kind of like that. There's these words in there that don't appear anywhere else in Mark's gospel. But it ends, and it's as if the gospel writer turns to us, expecting us to respond. So Josh McCarroll was up early on that June day in 2018. He was a photographer for the Capital Gazette, the newspaper in Annapolis, Maryland, and it was a big day. It was induction day in the Naval Academy, which is the day all the freshmen show up. And even though they do this every year, the people in Annapolis like to see the pictures in their paper. And he's been a photographer there for 14 years, and it was one of his favorite assignments because you could get the greatest pictures. At the start, the young people are showing up and they're with their parents and they're crying and they're hugging. And then an hour and a half later, the young men have had their heads shaved and the young women have this regulation cut. And then they're getting yelled at by the Marines because they're not standing up straight enough. He had been there early. The light was perfect. He was really pleased with the shots he had. And so he headed home to file them. Normally would have gone into the paper, but he would have chatted with all of his colleagues. And it was his daughter's birthday. He was a divorced dad of three children, and he'd made arrangements to pick his daughter up to take her out for snowballs, which is this kind of shaved ice that everybody eats in Annapolis, Maryland. Um, so he got home, he filed the photos, he jumped in his Jeep, and he headed off to pick up his daughter. And then the phone rang, and it was Rick Hutzel, his boss, the editor. But he was on vacation, but he was always working. He almost didn't pick the phone up because he was afraid he'd call him to an assignment. Hello? And he said, are you in the newsroom? There's been a report of a shooting there. It's probably not true. And just at that moment, Josh, going down the highway, saw a dozen emergency vehicles coming at him, going 100 miles an hour. And he's done this so long reporting that he could tell by the posture of the guys driving the trucks how serious it was. So he exited, he made his way to the paper, and already the whole area was cordoned off. And he jumped out, and just instinct took over. He saw a couple of other reporters who hadn't been in the newsroom. One had the day off, another had been at a late lunch. They exchanged hugs, they tried to share information, and then instinct took over and they just started recording the story. Of course, they couldn't go in the newsroom. They were in the back of one of their pickup trucks using the lighter for fuel so they could capture their stories. And many of you know the story, what happened. An enraged man, angry with the Gazette for a story they published years before, had gone in and killed five of their colleagues. But the real story was the bravery of those three journalists who, in the back of that pickup truck, gave witness to the truth, gave witness to the beauty of their colleagues who had been lost. And at one point, one of them tweeted out, I can tell you this, we're putting out a damn paper tomorrow. And that went viral, as a way of saying how important the press is, how much we have to stand with journalists who are, under attack. And as tough as that day was, the next day and the next week and the next month would be so much more painful as the shock wore off and the trauma of what they'd been through continued. And Chris Benderev, who's an NPR reporter, did a masterful job of covering these journalists for the next 2 years, kind of to tell their story about what happens when the cameras go away and those people who've been the victim continue to suffer. And she told in a beautiful way how they all made their way in a different way to life. The 22-year-old reporter who hid under the desk, the trauma, the triggering, every time she heard a loud noise, different from those who hadn't been in the newsroom, who felt guilt. And she covered all the different ways they've tried to make their way to life. And listening to that podcast, I kept thinking about Esther Perel. She's that couples therapist I've talked about before. She's focused all of her life on coming back to life after you've experienced a loss or a betrayal. She knows it because her parents were both survivors of the Holocaust. Her father was in 14 concentration camps and her mother in 9. They were the sole survivor of their family, and they met on the road out of Poland. And they looked at each other like so many other people. I'm alive, you're alive, I've lost everything, and you've lost everything. Let's get married and have a child. Some of those relationships worked out, some of them didn't. Her parents had a passion and a joy. Esther was raised in a community in Belgium entirely of Holocaust survivors. And she learned there were two types of people. There were the people who didn't die, and then there were the people who found a way to come back to life. The people who died just didn't die. They never were able to speak about it. They lived lives that were really tethered to the ground. They were afraid. They were frightened. The other group found a way to speak about it and to process it and recover a sense of passion and joy. That is not overnight, and that is not automatic. And so it's no wonder that in the most original gospel version, we find the women, what they have been through, the crucifixion and the trauma, and they show up, and a guy in a white sheet tells us, yeah, he's not here, he's risen, go on, tell. And instead, they lose their voice, they can't find it, and they're silent. And as dissatisfying as that ending is, this is not the game winning shot at the buzzer. I like it because the writer turns to us and says, how will you tell the story? How will you live it out? How will you be a person of resurrection? It's not really just the Gospel of Mark. All of the gospel writers turn to us very quickly. Matthew and Luke and John, even though they have these elaborate resurrection appearances where Jesus shows up to the women and the men, and then, he's on the road to Emmaus, and then he's frying fish on the beach. But real quickly, the focus is back on us. Our good friend and scholar, Matt Meyer Bolton, says the Gospel of John is a symphony with three movements. The first movement, the crucifixion. The second movement, the resurrection. The third movement, the resurrection of the community. Jesus is the grain of wheat that falls to the ground and then rises in us. Jesus leaves and he returns and he leaves again so the Spirit can be let loose in us so that we will do far greater things than he was able. That's what it says. We will do far greater things. We will live out resurrection and justice and peace. We will live out healing and wholeness and equity. And then in the Gospel of Luke, oh my gosh, there's the Gospel of Luke, right? Tells the story of Jesus. And then there's a whole other book, the book of Acts. The whole book is about the resurrected community. It's about, there's no border walls, there's no boundaries. It's all these people from all these different places speaking all these different languages who hear one another. And then twice we're told there is not a needy person among them because they share every single thing. And then, oh my gosh, we've got the Ethiopian eunuch. That is a trans person. That is what that is, a trans person who is welcomed, who is celebrated. And then there's Lydia, right? The businesswoman who makes the purple. I mean, it's this glorious community of resurrection everywhere you look. That is what me and Paula have tried to preach every single Sunday this last year, because there has been so much crucifixion, right? From COVID to George Floyd to the insurrection. Every single Sunday, we have preached an Easter sermon. Here is just this last year's sermons, right here. This is all this resurrection, folks. Every Sunday, we've tried to bring it to you. I remember last Easter, we had just gone in the shutdown. Who would have imagined that we would still be here? And I talked about Charles Fritz, that scholar of disasters, and he had that beautiful line that a true disaster is a gift because it liberates us to see that everyday life is a disaster for so many people. That a true disaster makes it possible for us to go in a new way, right? Like that Hancock Bank during Hurricane Katrina I talked about in 2005, remember? Their headquarters, 17 stories, was soaked and drenched, and almost all of their banks across the South were just destroyed. And their people needed money. And so they sent their employees to the ATMs from casinos to everywhere they could find them. And they gathered up the money. They had to wash it in their washing machines. And then they set up card tables, remember? And they handed out $200 to anybody who would give them their name and their social security number and their phone number. And they gave out $42 million. $3.5 million went to people who weren't even their customers. And when it was all said and done, they got all of that money back, but $200,000. Because those bankers, remember, they looked at their mission statement. It said nothing about profits. It said everything about people. That disaster gave them a chance to be new. And then there was a story about the little boy in the refugee camp, remember? Just a little bitty guy. And every day he would gather up plastic and bamboo, and he would make kites for the really little kids, for the new kids in the refugee camp. He could feel it, the passion as he made the kite. He could feel in the string if it would fly high, soar in the air. Or there was Drew Lanham. He was that black birder. He wrote about birding while black. When he was at Clemson, he was an engineer student. He hated it. And then he looked at the birds laying in the grass near his grandmother's farm. And he went back, he changed his major to ornithology. Remember that line from Howard Thurman? Don't ask what the world needs. Ask what makes you come alive. And do that, because that's what the world needs. People who are alive. Oh my gosh, me and Paula, we've tried to preach that for 52 weeks. Come alive, passion, find it. And we've preached about practices too, because even the most passionate person, even the Buck O'Neill, pulls his Bible out. And we've talked about so many things like just listening, like trying to get over the empathy wall, trying not to, yeah, but to lean in and to really look and to hear with your whole body. And we talked about listening to ourselves, right? Carving out time to meditate and to think. If you don't have a gratitude practice, you got to get it right now, every morning. What was delicious about yesterday? And what will I enjoy today? And then my favorite new practice, that exercise from the Stoic philosopher about the last time you'll ever do anything, especially the things that are difficult, like unloading the dishwasher. The day will come, the last time you'll be able to unload the dishwasher, because you won't be strong. And going out to run in the 4-degree weather someday will be the last time I'm ever able to do that. And then, of course, the practice of generosity, of giving, of justice. We have to keep finding more ways to discover, to share, to change, to be different. All of that is what kept those reporters at the Capital Gazette going. It was the passion they had, the shared mission to tell the truth, believing that the story mattered. And it were the practices they did. Every week they had a little weekly award on Wednesday at the end of his staff meeting. They could nominate someone for the best story, and they would read out all the nominations. And the winner got a $5 gift card for a cup of coffee. But the most important part was really just hearing one another's names. It was the passion and the practices and the people especially that kept them going. As Josh McCarrow said, the newsroom was the one place where I felt understood. And so it was so devastating when they got the news in the middle of 2020 that the newsroom would be closing. They could take their desks and they could go up the street 45 minutes to the Baltimore Sun. It's hard to explain really what that loss meant to reporters who had lost so much. I think about my own dad. He worked for the Dallas Times-Herald for 30-something years. And I remember they were up here visiting us once over Thanksgiving. And when they got home, they found out the Dallas Morning News had bought the Herald and shut it down. And just like that, my dad in his early 60s, everything he'd known and given his life to, and his close friends, just gone. But Josh McCarrow, I mean, he'd seen the people he loved killed for trying to tell the news. Some of the reporters decided to take a buyout. I mean, you could tell there was this hedge fund company that was coming for their paper, some hedge fund company that didn't care anything at all about the news, just wanted to sell off the assets. Some of the reporters stayed. Josh McCarroll got an offer from a buyout. He didn't want it. He wanted to stay there, but he'd been there 6 years since his last raise. He made $45,000 a year. He asked the boss just for a word of encouragement, an extra day of vacation. It wouldn't have taken much, but they told him he wasn't production critical and that the reporters could just take pictures with their cell phones. And so he decided to leave. He knew he could make more money just filming weddings, and his mother had pancreatic cancer and he could be with her. So he took the buyout. That was in February of 2020. His calendar was booked with events, and then COVID. And every single thing he had lined up, and his mother's death, and all that he had lost. And the grief was just absolutely overwhelming. And then one day, the Osprey returned from their 5,000-mile migration. Those beautiful great hawks from the Amazon all the way to Annapolis. And he took his camera out there and he photographed those birds. The next day, it was the common sparrows around his house. The next day, he went back out and took more pictures. He made a post called Today's Birds. A few days later, he kept expanding it, adding from birds to include some frogs and some flowers, some fish pooling in the creek. He decided it was his mission and his calling every single day to get up early in the morning and go out and give testimony to this beautiful, radiant, powerful, amazing world from the back of a pickup truck, telling about his friends who'd been massacred, turning his camera out into the world, allowing us to see the beauty that's still possible. The ospreys return. The little boy makes a kite. The tattoo artist takes a swastika, makes it into a swan. The bank hands out money. The Capitol employees, those faithful servants, 2,400 of them, return every day to clean, to repair, to mend. The president weeps. The vice president calls us to dance. A couple decide to heal. A young man goes into recovery. A teenager comes out boldly and says, "This is who I am." And somewhere, a 75-year-old man is holding a sign right now that says, "Black Lives Matter." Mass shootings, a police officer with his knee on the neck. That's not the end. No. We'll tell the story. We'll tell how it ends. And we'll start today. Amen.